Hello and welcome to the Full Scottish here at Broadcasting Scotland. My name is Donald C. Stewart and I am delighted on the day in which the clocks have fallen back into winter time to invite and to introduce two bright guests to make the day all that better. And we have firstly Martin Docherty-Hughes, who is the Member of Parliament for Western Bartonshire. Welcome, Martin.
Nice to see you.
Martin was elected to Parliament in 2015 as the MP for Western Bartonshire, having had a stellar career in the local authority, both at Glasgow and the youngest councillor in Clydebank. Sharing an interest in that side of Scotland, of course, is my other guest, Simon Barrow, who is Director of the Politics, Ethics and Beliefs think tank Ekklesia, editor and author of a number of books, including, most recently, A Better Nation, The Challenges of Scottish Independence. Welcome, Simon.
Great to be here.
And as always, even on a Sunday, we begin with the news from Ukraine. And of great concern is the news on day 249 of the illegal occupation of Ukraine by Russia, that Russia has said it will pull out of a UN-brokered grain export deal after a dramatic attack by Ukrainian airborne and underwater drones on its Black Sea naval base of Sevastopol in the early hours of Saturday morning. The Russian government has written to the United Nations saying it is indefinitely suspending the Black Sea grain deal that allowed vital exports of Ukrainian food supplies. President Biden has said that Russia's actions were outrageous. Furthermore, the UN Secretary-General has urged Russia and Ukraine to renew the grain deal that has seen more than 8 million tonnes of grain exported from Ukraine and brought down global food prices. The agreement between Ukraine and Russia was, however, due to expire on the 19th of November. Meanwhile, the UK Ministry of Defence has said Russia's Defence Ministry was peddling false claims of an epic scale. This came after Moscow accused the British Navy of a terrorist attack on Nord Stream gas pipelines, claiming British specialists aided a drone attack in Sevastopol. The Ministry of Defence said this latest invented story says more about the arguments going on inside the Russian government than it does about the West. Within their own borders, Ukrainian electricity supplies were recovering after concerted Russian attacks on generating plants. But emergency blackouts, warned President Zelensky, may still be needed. In a further blow to Russia, the European Union has frozen Russian assets worth about 17 billion euros since Moscow invaded Ukraine, according to the EU Justice Commissioner Didier Reynders. In humanitarian news, up to 100 prisoners of war have reportedly been exchanged between Russia and Ukraine. And a further blow to Russia's invasion was the news that Russian-backed forces have claimed they have finished a pullout of civilians from the key southern Ukrainian city of Kherson. Using innovative technology within Ukraine has seen a mobile phone app developed by Ukrainian volunteers to allow civilians to report sightings of incoming Russian drones and missiles, and it is hoped increase the proportion shot down before they hit the ground. Now, Martin, as a member of the UK Defence Select Committee, I'm quite sure that the reports that are coming from Russia in terms of some sort of underhand move up in the Nord Stream gas pipeline comes not as a surprise, but as a concern that this disinformation is beginning to make its way into world and global news.
Well, Donald, as a former member of the Defence Select Committee, I've been my colleague Dave Duggan is now the SNP member on that committee. I would just say I don't really take the Russian Federation's propaganda very serious, and I can't imagine why anyone in Western Europe would be involved in undermining the transfer of gas along any Nord Stream pipeline, whether it be one or two. So I just think, the Russian Federation is playing to their own internal propaganda and, trying to demonize MD who is opposed to their process. So I wouldn't take it serious, quite frankly.
And Simon, in terms of what is coming out of Russia, and also the very, very impressive Ukrainian attempts to rebuff the Russian invasion, it certainly seems that there are good humanitarian use, innovative technology used, but also on top of all of that, still a great concern that this is a war very much on everybody's doorstep.
Well, yes, and it's, as you have reported with the news this morning, Donald, it's a multi-part war. I mean, it's an armed conflict. It's also an information conflict, and it's an economic conflict as well, which is drawing the rest of the world in. And so, I mean, I guess the question is how you begin to look at resolution of this conflict, because, I mean, Putin's attack has been stemmed, and that's obviously really good news. The question is how successful the Ukrainian counteroffensives will be, and they'll all probability lead to some successes, but the question is how much. The reality at the moment is unlikely Putin will be completely defeated, certainly not over the coming winter. So, what happens if the Russians dig in on the defensive next spring? And, how long can the war go on, leading to the appalling deaths and suffering that we're seeing, but also the economic pain that's being stacked up on Europe and the UK. So I think, the other thing that we need to be aware of is, the very, very alarming talk of theoretical plans to make use of nuclear weapons tactically. And we need to be clear that there is, in fact, no such thing as a tactical nuclear weapon. Their yields are similar to the Hiroshima bomb, which is, of course, a city buster. So, the question is what we do. The former Joint Chiefs chair has called for talks to end the war. That's retired Admiral Mike Mullen. And he said we must do everything possible we can to try to get to the table to resolve this thing. And I know that sounds really difficult when you're dealing with someone like Putin, but it's going to have to go in that direction. The question is how we get it there. That's where I think we're looking for guidance from Martin and others in Parliament as to how we, where the next steps are in this.
And Martin, I suppose in a sense, in your role as, I believe, as the spokesperson for the SNP on the industries of future and blockchain, that one eye on the economics of this particular conflict is very important, and being part of the SNP group down in Westminster gives you at least an insight into what it is that this is, what effect this is actually having, rather than the effect that some government ministers would claim it's having on the economy.
Well, I have to say, the notion, I know that Simon coming this in terms of negotiation with the Russian Federation, I think it'd be very problematic for the Ukrainian government, not just the Ukrainian government, but the Ukrainian people. And I know there are people who are Ukrainian who also identify as ethnically Russian, who would not want to negotiate with Vladimir Putin. It's a very, we need to be very kind of, I think, open and upfront about the complexity of what's on the ground in Ukraine, and that any idea that anyone's going to negotiate with a tyrant like Vladimir Putin, I think that's problematic. Is how would you get to that point when someone's sending over drones from Iran on a regular basis, when you're there, and also in local, people are having to come up with apps on their mobile phones to try and track these drones which are getting supplied to the Russian Federation by Iran. I don't know how you get there, I have to say. I really don't. I think if you're standing up against fascism in a physical armed conflict, there are problems for those on the ground about how you negotiate with fascists, because that, I think for them, I have to say that would be profoundly problematic, and I think it would probably be profoundly problematic for most folk in Western Europe. So I don't know how you get to that point. The use of technology, I think, is interesting. What's been going on in Sevastopol, Russia, trying to use drones, etc., to kind of undermine the electrical supply across the whole nation of Ukraine, is kind of maybe taking bitten off more than it can chew, because at the end of the day, Ukraine's turned around and said, okay, no worries, let's do the exact same to you, and done as a mass drone attack on the Russian fleet in the Black Sea. So, I have to say, I think any negotiation around Vladimir Putin is going to be problematic, but in terms of these notions of using technology, new technology, in a more kind of practical sense in terms of the kind of theatre of a armed conflict is going to be what you're seeing now is probably conflict as we will see it over the next 20 to 30 years in any kind of armed conflict situation would like. But in terms of this conflict and this war, I don't really see how you can negotiate with somebody like Vladimir Putin.
Well, of
Okay.
course, the bulwark against any dictatorship would always be democracy, and we hear that the music has stopped in Westminster, which means that this week it is Rishi Sunak's turn to be Prime Minister. And in news that surprised many, he gave Suella Braverman a second chance so that reportedly she could crack down harder on protesters, deport more refugees, and try to outdo Liz Truss at compromising national security. At least, however, and in a blow to the Labour Party, it would appear that the voters generally would rather trust Rishi Sunak than Keir Starmer in attempting to solve economic crises. So, Martin, not necessarily good news for Scotland, because once again we have a second unelected, as it were, Prime Minister in the hot seat, but also that it looks as though he's giving opportunities to people that blotted their copybook before, and then it looks for the Labour Party as if they're not quite as popular as they would have wished.
I need to say I'm always kind of a bit dubious about polls. The only poll that matters is an election, whether it be a general election in the UK or a general election here in Scotland or a local government one. You always got to take any poll with a big pinch of salt. You mentioned the Home Secretary. From my perspective, I think it's really odd. There was an article in The Guardian this weekend, the fact that we're now getting into the third investigation into the reappointed Home Secretary in terms of leaking sensitive information. That's actually in relation to the Northern Ireland Protocol. That Home Secretary should not be in place. And what's even more concerning to me is, we only talk about the Home Secretary. What we don't talk about is Sir Gavin Williamson, and a person who was sacked by Theresa May, who is now back in the cabinet, and who was sacked for leaking state secrets. There are some people in Parliament, even in the Conservative and Unionist Party, who think that certain people who are now in the cabinet should probably be locked up in the Tower of London. So these two appointments are, I think, kind of highlight that the Conservative and Unionist Party has lost its way in terms of notions of national security, good governance, and what it means to be a cabinet minister and to kind of show leadership. I found the first appointment of the Home Secretary strange, but this reappointment is just quite extraordinary. And Gavin Williamson coming in after being sacked by Theresa May is just, well, what can you say? It's a Prime Minister who clearly owes more to his reactionary right wing than most would think.
And Simon, I suppose, in a sense, it's one of the difficulties that we're going to have regarding any form of independence, that clearly that there seems to be, from the outside, the look of a Conservative Party that's going to govern no matter what people think.
Well, yeah, indeed. And the other difficulty connected with that, of course, is that in terms of its opposition, Labour is really offering only slightly different versions of what's being put forward by the Conservative Party at the moment, including, of course, over the key issue of Brexit. Before going into that further, though, I mean, we're dealing with existential issues here, but I must say in relation to the previous question, because there was a little bit of misrepresentation going on there. I know in no way suggested that Ukraine should sit down with Putin or that one should outrightly negotiate with fascists. What I was saying was that we can't simply accept the death and destruction that's going on, that nobody is likely to win this militarily, and there's going to have to be some framework for arriving at a solution. And that's got to involve massive international cooperation and pressure on Putin, the containment of Putin, etc. So I think it's very important to stress that. But we can't avoid the fact that there's going to be some kind of negotiated settlement, and of course, negotiation very much also on the domestic agenda that we're talking about now, and the question of really Scotland needing to find another path, because It's not just the sort of internal fighting and collapse within the Conservative government at the moment and the lack of an effective opposition. It's also a crisis for the institution of Westminster itself. And if any solution is going to be found to that, it's going to require some considerable break with the current system. I think Scotland can take the lead on that.
So, Martin, in terms of being in Westminster, in terms of seeing how people operate, for me, I was astonished at Williamson coming back, as indeed you were. I was also astonished to see Michael Gove make a reappearance after all that he had said. Is it just simply now that despite what anybody says, that the Scottish voice in Westminster has only got one outlet? And when Liz Truss said she was going to ignore the First Minister, is there any hope that actually they'll pay attention to the Westminster Group or indeed our First Minister from this point forward?
It's an interesting thing. I mean, you said being in Westminster. Sometimes, I often say that, people say to me, whereabouts in London do you live? And I say, the west of Scotland. So being in Westminster is a bit of an odd kind of descriptive to that. Yeah, when you're sitting in there and you see some of the process, I mean, as Simon said, it's unfit for purpose. Scotland's best opportunity is to be an independent sovereign state I hope, within the European Union. And, I think Westminster in so many ways, for a range of reasons, not just in recent political thoughts, is done. I mean, and not just for Scotland, I think in terms for England and Wales and also for Northern Ireland, I think it's a busted flush, and there will be profound change, which is about to happen. And I think sometimes in politics we don't see the kind of societal change across, the kind of demographics of society, and I think there's a huge change coming. Yeah, look, Theresa May, not Theresa May, but Liz Truss. There's not many prime ministers, you forget which one it is. Liz Truss's premiership was, I think, the top of kind of post-imperial Westminster system and going absolutely nuts. And there has been a profound, I think, awakening in the Tory party as to, they keep saying that they're the great old Tory party, and they've been around for God knows how long, but I think they are utterly disconnected from the lived experience of most of even their own backbenchers who come from the Red Wall, and that is in many ways going to be their downfall. Problem for the British Labour Party is, how do they replace that on the issues of making Brexit work and shipping people to Rwanda who are fleeing war or fleeing utter economic disaster? That doesn't marry up with being a social democratic party, putting people in the House of Lords. It's kind of a nuance on what it means to be a British government, and I think frankly people in Scotland are done with that, and they want something completely different.
Simon, I was very much struck by the 44 days of a Liz Truss premiership, basically on the same way that I was struck by Brian Clough's management of Leeds over 44 days. And of course, famously, Brian Clough walked in and said, put all your medals in the bin, you won them by cheating, where Liz Truss stood up in front of the Conservative Party and said, for 12 years, you've not been very good at managing the economy, and then went on to demonstrate just exactly how bad it could get. What do you think that the SNP, as the major representatives of the Scottish people in Westminster, ought to be looking to doing in order to make changes?
Well, first of all, I think Martin is much more at the centre of that than I am, obviously. But I think it's a question of doing a number of things. One is, of course, highlighting that what we're dealing with here is a problem with the system in itself. Not just with one party, but obviously the reality that Scotland faces is that it hasn't given a majority to the Conservatives since 1959, and that was in votes, not in seats. And yet, for much of that time, we have been ruled by them. So it doesn't work democratically for us, but also the Westminster system itself is not working for the regions of England. It's not working for Wales. It's certainly not working for Northern Ireland, which I think we'll come on to in a minute. So we're dealing with a system problem here. I think the broader agenda actually is that moving towards independence for the nations of these islands and greater autonomy for the regions could actually lead to a reformulation of a kind of genuinely voluntary arrangement around what could be called not federalism but confederalism, independent nations and regions looking at how they can work together on the basis of genuine and equal partnership rather than the dominance of one section of the country through an unequal system. So I think those kind of horizons are ones that need to be raised, but obviously parliamentarians from Scotland, particularly the SNP group, are looking to do as much as they can to get the best deal for Scotland economically, because the levers are held in Westminster at the moment. They're doing a huge amount in Scotland in a whole range of ways, and then in partnership with the Scottish Government, which is looking to move in a different direction in a whole range of areas, including social security, etc. And again, I think we'll come on to the environmental and economic challenges. So the fabric of that is up to Martin and his colleagues, but I think the broad horizon of change for the benefit of Scotland, but also for the benefit of all those in the nations of these islands who are all suffering from a dysfunctional Westminster system, is something we need to get more into the discourse. It's not just about Scotland wishing to make a break and to reform European relationships. It's also about system change for the benefit of everyone on these islands.
And I suppose, Martin, that brings a bit of a conundrum to those who are on the boat but wish it would sink. That what you're attempting to do is to bring down that particular vessel, but at the same time find a means through which you can get something of value to the people you represent. And I suppose, in a sense, that's why the SNP government has gone to the courts to try and seek some form of referendum, because the pathway through a broken democratic process doesn't seem to be working. So what is it that the SNP can do, whether it be from your armchair in your home up in Scotland or down on the green benches at Westminster?
Well, I say that, Donald, I'm a bankie, and ships built in Clydebank don't sink. So the kind of analogy, I don't think, kind of runs true for a range of reasons. If anyone's going to sink the ship of the UK, the premise is actually on the British government, and it's not on us either, on the SNP or for the nation of Scotland. And, we have to be mindful that a lot of people in Scotland still want to be part of the United Kingdom. So there is a narrative for us and an engagement process for us to make sure that people understand, not just what those of us in the SNP, because we're not the only people who believe that Scotland, or political party that believes that Scotland should be an independent sovereign state. There are members of the British Labour Party. We've seen kind of polling, which obviously is a bit dubious, but polling that says the majority or a substantial amount of Labour members in Scotland believe in independence. We have the Scottish Green Party, which is clear in its constitutional position, and there are even people on the right, and that might concern some folk, but even in independent Scotland, people will vote Conservative. So the premise for us is to make sure that we are utilising as much of the democratic process as possible, that we can consistently and coherently articulate a position in which we remind the British government that the Conservative and Unionist Party has not had a mandate in Scotland. It's actually, as Simon was saying earlier, since the 1950s. Now, we need to utilise the constitutional position. I'm afraid that, whether I like it or not, Scotland voted to remain within the United Kingdom in 2014. My own constituency voted to leave the United Kingdom. But any proposition that we are putting to the nation, whether it be the SNP, whether it be the Scottish Green Party, or whether it be anyone else who believes that Scotland has its right to national self-determination, is to put that question based on hope, based on legitimacy, and based on the rule of law. And that's what the Scottish Government, at least from my perspective, are doing, utilising the Supreme Court. We might get a kind of rather strange answer, I think. There is a possibility that the Supreme Court will turn around and say, actually, this isn't a legal question, this is a political question. And we'll put it back to you, the politicians, to deal with that. And I don't think we give that enough airtime either. So, the Supreme Court is not going to be the be all and end all. I was quite not surprised, but I'm glad that the First Minister did go down that, if the Supreme Court says that the Scottish Parliament doesn't have that right, then we will put that as the premise of our next manifesto commitment at the next British general election, because it was always, and forgive me for kind of paraphrasing Margaret Thatcher, but Margaret Thatcher was the one who was very clear that if the Scottish nation sends a majority of pro-independence MPs to the British Parliament, then that is a means for negotiation. and that's to kind of paraphrase what they said and Margaret Thatcher said in their own biography. So, we need to be very clear that we go down the rule of law, we try and utilise every element of a democratic process, and if the law courts say that there's a limitation in terms of the Parliament of Scotland, then the First Minister was right. It's a general election, and it's up to us, not just in the SNP, but in the other political parties who believe in independence, to make sure that we give the people of Scotland the reason and the will and the ability and the hope to vote for independence at a general election or a referendum.
Yeah, I mean,
And
I think Martin
sorry,
has
Sam.
got the right emphasis there. And I mean, two other quick things just to add to that, Donald. I mean, the first is that there is actually a real crisis for the UK as a whole implicit in all of this, because if it turns out that legally there is no constitutional way in which the people of Scotland can actually determine their own future lawfully, that's a constitutional crisis, because the union is supposed to be a voluntary union. And so the way to push that then, of course, is politically in the way that Martin is suggesting. The other thing I think it's important to be aware of is that the United Kingdom and Britain are not the same thing. The United Kingdom is a particular political arrangement. And as I was saying a few moments ago, it's in crisis. It's in crisis for Scotland, but it's also in crisis for the regions of England, for Wales, and for Northern Ireland at the moment. And we need an alternative. Now, Scotland's alternative is to look to become an independent, self-governing nation, but that opens up the possibility of re-looking at the relationships between these islands. Because I think when Martin said, a lot of people want to be part of the UK, actually a lot of people want to still feel that they are British and part of the arrangement on these islands. So I think it's important to say that Scottish independence can actually begin to pioneer a way forward for all of us, as well as for Scotland. But the UK as a political arrangement is in crisis at the moment and is not delivering.
And if strangeness within the boundaries of the United Kingdom were part of politics at the moment, then outside internationally, Rishi Sunak, Prime Minister, has said he will not go to COP27. The King, Charles III, has been banned from going, and Therese Coffey, the Environment Minister, has downplayed its significance and importance. However, Scotland's First Minister says that she'll be going. And if I can turn to you, first of all, Simon, this is an interesting aspect of it. I don't know if you saw the car crash television interview, and I have to give credit to my colleague here, Miranda, who talked of Coffey's cups, where she talked about the only reason why she was going to be helpful in terms of an environmental crisis was to use a cup that she could use again and again. This seems to be, given where we are environmentally, one of the most strange and bizarre series of decisions in amongst an even greater number of them.
Yeah, indeed. Well, I mean, of course, in that particular interview, she was asked what she was personally doing for the environment, and she struggled to think of anything except perhaps using non-disposable cups. I mean, it was just a really pathetic sight, unfortunately. And of course, she also has links with the Institute for Economic Affairs, which has been part of a movement towards climate skepticism, which is effectively about sort of not total denial, but putting a brake on action. But I mean, the context of this and of Rishi Sunak not attending COP27, of course, is the latest UN report, which says that there's no credible path to 1.5% rise in temperature over the next 40 years, which is really absolutely crucial. The current path is towards 2.5% with the promises that have been made but still not delivered, or even higher, 2.8 or 3% without, which is just catastrophe for the planet, really. So, an actual reduction in energy use and transformational change are on the agenda. And we are absolutely nowhere near that. I mean, net zero is not going to be enough to sustain the course that we need. Green private investment of over 140 billion over 5 years is needed to hit the targets, but that's threatened by interest rates due to the economic crisis that the government has plunged us further into. And in the meantime, Rishi Sunak is not going, as if talking about the planet is some kind of option. And one might ask, I mean, it's been revealed recently that of his own campaign contributions, a quarter of them come from fossil fuel companies or dependent industries. He's intending, astonishingly, to ban onshore wind farms in England. he stopped fracking, yes, in England, but because of the huge government support that would be needed, not because of environmental issues. And it's a good thing that that's happened. But with planning law changes, they're going to threaten the natural habitat. I mean, even the RSPB, the Royal Society of Protection of Birds, has been up in arms over this. So, the UK government is completely failing over that. Onto that final question of King Charles and so on, he's been, a spokesperson for environmental concern over the years. That's a good thing. One might raise questions about his private planes and helicopters, exemptions from environmental protection, huge houses, etc. Sort of brought that into it. But I mean, there's no leadership coming from the UK at all. And Alok Sharma, who of course has been demoted from the cabinet, has had to speak out today on that. I mean, what a catastrophe it is. I'm glad that Nicola Sturgeon is going, but at the moment the UK is being let down again. And I mean, this is, a threat to the whole planet.
Of course, Martin, one of the changes in the cabinet that we didn't reflect on was Alok Sharma being removed, who had been the chair at COP26. And much though the fracking ban was very welcome, the reasoning behind it, as Simon was just pointing out, was nothing to do with environmental changes, but to do with finance and economics. It must be a very, very worrying time for all of us, because Scotland does believe that it has a fairly good story to tell, but if we're the only ones telling it, will we be drowned out by the fog and the fugue from elsewhere?
No, I don't think so. I mean, I think part of the whole energy story for Scotland is a huge opportunity for what's about to unfold for us as an independent sovereign state. And I think it's a huge story to kind of really shout loudly, and we don't shout loudly enough about Scotland's ability to become a major green energy producer. And I noted that, if you look at the paper that was recently published by Ian Blackford, Stephen Flynn and Alan Brown from the Westminster Group on the possibilities for energy production in Scotland, it shows that Scotland can, if it wants to be, as an independent country, a major producer of renewable energy in the world, and to really replace carbon energy production. And I think it was also interesting, Simon mentioned around, issues around consumption, because that's another thing we don't talk about. So one thing to produce energy is what are we producing energy for? And is it compatible with the issues that the global catastrophe which is unfolding around us? I mean, if you look at some of the UN reports, if you look at some of the statistics, as the MP for West Dunbartonshire, Simon will know, being a Dumbarton man, that we are looking at, for me as a constituency MP, parts of Dumbarton being flooded, parts of kind of the Upper Clyde at Clydebank being flooded in a way in which we could never imagine, say, even 15 years ago. And that is it's the physical change to people's lives will be about the encroaching elements of quite frankly, the North Atlantic into the west of Scotland. And people think, oh, we live in a really mountainous country and everything else. Well, you don't really. You live in the kind of flat areas of that mountainous country. So those are the kind of practical implications for us. But the other issue around Alok Sharma. Now, Alok Sharma does have a lot of support across the benches in the British Parliament. He is seen as somebody who is from the sanest part of the Conservative and Unionist Party, and in this he had a lot of respect from parliamentarians across the board at COP26. The issue of the monarch, well, that's a really weird one. I don't think anyone would have expected the Queen Elizabeth II to have turned up at COP26. Should we accept that the new monarch should turn up to COP27? Sorry. As a real formal practical role, it's a really weird one for, excuse me, for anybody who's a supporter of constitutional monarchy. Is that what is the role of the monarch? I think that's for a different day. I just think it's a whole weird thing that they've got themselves into there. That the palace and Downing Street clearly are not communicating in the way in which they probably normally would. But again, when you're changing prime minister so often, that probably gets a wee bit more complicated. And that's probably got a wee bit more to do with it. Would Scotland send its head of state, whether it was a monarchy or an elected head of state? Possibly, but probably for a very non-political purpose. I think there is the issue, as Simon said, that the UK is really taking its eye off the ball when it comes to the cataclysm that's about to unfold for us, and it's all kind of round this whole issue about the kind of really bad management of government through Westminster at the moment. So another reason for independence, quite frankly.
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
Sorry,
And
Simon,
I
on you
mean,
go.
just to say, I think Martin's completely right. And the monarch issue is really a sideshow and almost a distraction. Actually, of course, there are other Commonwealth countries that could invite him if they wanted to, etc. But really, that's a sideshow. The main issue is the dramatic failure of the UK government. But as Martin rightly says, this is a crucial issue for Scotland. I mean, Scotland has, most estimates show that Scotland has something like 35% of the whole of Europe's on and offshore renewable energy potential. We absolutely know future lies. The two questions are, who will take decisions about that future? Will it be the people of Scotland themselves, or will it be a Westminster government, which we've already seen has completely wasted the oil and gas legacy? And secondly, who will own that future? And that is important at the moment. I mean, Scotland is boxed in, but there is a danger that more and more of that renewable energy potential will go out with our control to transnational companies. Now, the Welsh government has just announced that it's opening a pathway to a renewable energy company which will be publicly owned. The SNP and indeed the Greens have called for this on a number of occasions, the SNP conference in September and the one before last year. The Scottish Government has not acted on that yet. I hope it will. There are severe challenges as to how one could capitalise such a renewable energy company at the moment, or at least fully capitalise it, but we can take the first steps there. And really the question of Scotland and a green future, a sustainable future, an economically beneficial future, a future for the planet is one that ought to be central to the independence argument, it seems to me.
Well,
maybe can I just briefly, just for a second, Donald, I know we need to move on, but I think there's another part of this that we all miss, and that is the means of production of energy. And that is a big topic within not just the SNP, but from other groups, other political parties as well. There's one thing setting up an energy company, which I can understand. It's part of the manifesto commitment, etc. It's the means of production which are critical. It's the production, physical production of energy for consumption, which I think, in terms of the paper that Ian Blackford and Stephen Flynn and Alan Brown published, it's about the role of the citizen in the production of energy. And I think that's got the hugest amount of benefit for the entire country and for the planet as well. Putting people, the citizen, in control of the production of energy itself, other than just owning a company which supplies energy. So the production, I think, is a huge opportunity.
Briefly, Simon. Yep.
That's an incredibly important point that you've made there, Martin. But to clarify, what the Scottish Government has said it will not do is set up a retail company. That's, of course, entirely sensible. We're not talking about a retail company. We're talking about an asset-based production company. And that's actually what the SNP and the Greens have voted for. And that is something that the Scottish Government, I think, desperately needs to carry forward, or at least begin the process of that, because what you just said is entirely correct. It needs to be public investment in our energy future and potential, which is going to be absolutely massive, not only for the planet, but also in terms of the future prosperity of Scotland and these islands and beyond.
Well, it's very rare that we get a news item where one of our guests is mentioned in it, and this takes us over across the water, as it were, to Ireland. And this week, the Senate Public Consultation Committee met with Martin Docherty-Hughes and Richard Thompson MPs to discuss the constitutional future of the island of Ireland whilst in Northern Ireland. The DUP pact the return of government at Stormont, which will result in a new Northern Ireland general election. Martin, can you tell us what in the name of the wee man is going on?
Well, I think I know first of all to say that to be able to speak on the floor of the Snádairn was a rare privilege, I think, for anyone, never mind someone who usually sits in the House of Commons, to have been invited by the Cathaoirleach, the chair of the Snádairn. It was an immense privilege for both myself and for Richard to reflect on the lessons of the 2014 referendum. Clearly, there are members of the Houses of the Oireachtas to consider the implications of a future unification referendum should it happen. And it's maybe not as incoherent or complicated as people here in the UK or even here in Scotland would think about what's going on in the entire island of Ireland. But the committee of Shanadern, which is investigating this, is keen to hear from different voices around how they can reflect and build on a coherent and community-based process which could lead to a unification referendum should it come about. And I think that's to be commended, and it's at the right time.
It's an interesting quote there, Simon, to hear they're keen to hear from different voices. It's obviously not a feature of Northern Ireland politics going back very long that different voices tend to appear. It always seems to have the same timbre, the same message.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. And that's the depressing thing about it, because I mean, really, what you're having at the moment is a paralysis of government in Northern Ireland, and effectively the DUP holding the whole process to ransom because of its particular dogmatic position on the Northern Ireland Protocol. The other irony there, of course, is that Northern Ireland actually benefits from the arrangements that enable it to have, access to the European single market and so on. And yet there's a kind of dogmatic line that because this is, out of step with other parts of the UK, then, it must be effectively withdrawn and abolished. And the difficulty, of course, is that the election is unlikely to resolve that problem. The question is how you move out of gridlock, much as we were talking with Ukraine at the moment. I mean, the damage is continuing, and the question is how you move out of gridlock. Thankfully, of course, with the peace process, not an armed one, but you should never forget that there are people in the background, who will try to exploit these problems the longer they go on. But as to the solution, it's difficult to know whether other parties can cooperate as far as possible to reduce DUP vote and influence in the coming election is an open question. There are severe practical and political limits to that. But the real pressure, I think, needs to come from the voices of the people themselves, because most people, whatever their views are on the constitutional future of the part of the world that they live in, want functioning health, functioning education, a functioning economy at the moment. And they're not really getting that. Many of the important decisions are being postponed. And of course, demographically, things are moving as well. And I think this is probably why the DUP is trying to dig its feet in such a strong way. It knows that the tide of history is moving in a different direction, and that a different kind of settlement is likely in the future. But in the immediate term, it's very difficult to see how we can move out of this gridlock.
And Martin, when you mentioned earlier on about there being a sane member of the Conservative and Unionist Party who was an MP in Parliament, and the need for us to recognise that there are people within Scotland who will wish to retain some form of a British identity. It's when you were in Ireland, was this something that you felt that there was a recognition of within the Irish Parliament and within those who were seeking to find a bridge to build in order to hold their referendum?
Do you know, the members of both houses of the Oireachtas have their own idea of what a united Ireland can look like. Not all of them want a united Ireland. I think there is a huge assumption outside of the island of Ireland about what Ireland's future should look like. And I certainly don't want to make any assumptions on that. As I said, not all members of the houses of the Oireachtas want one. I would also say maybe just go back slightly in terms of you were talking about different voices. Shanadern is 100 years old this year, and the Senate of Ireland was set up specifically to give voice to minorities, in that sense historically, to the unionist voice in the island of Ireland. And I was and Richard Thompson were on the panel with unionist voices from Northern Ireland who. And this is where it goes back to the crux of what will probably change the whole narrative about unionism in the north. Who these people coming from constituencies which are very demographically in terms of deindustrialisation, the impact of the industrial age are very similar to my own in Western Bartonshire. And we share much in common in terms of the huge challenges around inequality. And part of the discussion in which I sought to reflect on was that the Republic in many ways hasn't had to deal with that mass deindustrialization, the impact of the industrial age the way we saw it in Western Scotland, for example. It's not to say it didn't have any of it, but there are huge issues around class that no one wants to talk about, and the range of inequality in which coming from working class communities that we face, but also it's just to say that when it comes to change in Northern Ireland, there's huge change coming, but it's not just for unionism. It's also for nationalism and for the Republican movement in the North. They have an idea of what, and I'm very upfront with colleagues on both sides of that argument, or the three sides of that argument, that they are going to be challenged by a generation who, either being British or Irish, quite frankly, given where they are now, is utterly irrelevant. And that, you see the changing face, for example, of Sinn Féin in terms of its policies around equal marriage, around reproductive rights, that has been challenged to its core about how it sees social policy in the North as well. And that's what's going to happen to the DUP. And when that happens, I'm afraid both the DUP and others will be out of power, because people who are younger than me will change the face of the entire island of Ireland. And I do think that a lot of parliamentarians, both in Stormont and in the Houses of the Oireachtas, as well as Westminster and Holyrood, yet to see, don't get that. They don't see it yet, and that will come at a pace of knots at them, and suddenly they'll be probably swept out of the way in something that we can't even imagine will happen in the island of Ireland, which I hope is for the benefit of everybody who lives there.
And Simon, you clearly are thinking very much about how Ireland fits within that sort of constitutional structure.
Well, yes, although, I think the points that Martin has made about the way things are moving and the way they need to move are absolutely spot on, really. The difficulty that we face is that the immediate situation is still fairly grim. But I suppose the implication of what I was saying a few minutes ago is that I hope that, there is going to be an election. Most people don't want an election. The question with any election is, on whose terms is the discussion and argument of that election had? And what I was saying was that I think it needs to be had on the basis of the fact that most people, whatever their kind of tradition and history and indeed views on the future, want functioning health, education, economy, etc. They're not getting it at the moment. The whole process is being held to ransom. And I hope that, although we know how the DUP will try to use this election, I hope that everybody else can move on to the territory, which is about saying we need to open up the gateway to the future in precisely the way that Martin is talking about. I think younger people particularly are really fed up with the way politics has been conducted and the wasted opportunities that have existed, as well as the great gains of the peace process, the re-establishment of Stormont, etc. So I really hope that, much though what one fears that the gridlock will continue, those different voices will become much louder during this process nearer towards Christmas.
And one topic that is not going to go away and is certainly of great worry to working class communities within Scotland is the cost of living crisis, with an estimated fortune of over £700 million. Somebody asked this week, with eye-watering austerity 2.0 on its way, will Rishi Sunak end up in tears? Martin, it's really hard to get your head round just exactly what austerity 2.0 will mean specifically from communities the like of which you have in Clydebank. It's not so much the rising water that's going to be a principal concern going into this winter, but the rising cost of almost everything.
Well, Donald, just to put on record, it's not just Clydebank, it's Dumbarton and the Vale of Leven as well. So let's not forget, those two great boroughs. Look, 730 million, the personal wealth of a Prime Minister of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. The Leader of the Opposition is a Knight of the Realm. It's no change. It doesn't really matter who's in Downing Street, quite frankly, when it comes to kind of personal reflection that, whether it's your accumulated personal wealth or the wealth of position and privilege, that the Westminster system is broken. And, there is, people call it austerity 2.0. It's like, well, austerity never stopped. And it's this idea that it's something new. It's just a continuation of a Westminster process. I mean, we then look at what the British Labour Party want to do. They're not exactly saying that they're going to change a lot of what the Tory party has brought on board. And that just kind of stinks to high heaven, because one wonders why you call yourself a socialist or a social democrat in terms of the leverage of the state and to influence the economy and to reduce inequality. So, 730 million is a personal wealth. I mean, it's just extraordinary. I think I'm not getting involved in personalities. I just think that's kind of base politics. But when you have a prime minister who's also had a green card to work in another country, I find all that very, very odd. I just find that kind of approach to politics in a democratic state very bizarre. And it really shouldn't just be parliamentarians or citizens in Scotland who should be questioning that. I think there will be huge questions, I would hope, from our colleagues south of the border about what it means to have a PM who at one point was registering themselves to live in the United States because they didn't want to even register in their own the country in which they call home, in which they were born and brought up. And I just find that very, very strange that a prime minister of any country would seek to do that kind of stuff. I just think it very, very odd. But that's Westminster. It's the British Constitution. It's unwritten. And in some senses, they make it up as they go along. And, I think it's long overdue in terms of what Scotland's position is now to say, do you know what, enough is enough and let's get out of here.
Simon, I suppose, as Martin has just pointed out, austerity never stopped. And talking of cutting services when services are very much on their knees already, it's very difficult to see how anybody can legitimately say that there are going to be cuts to something that seems to even be sawed off at the bone.
Yeah, I mean, austerity is the wrong direction because it's going to lead to, a huge further economic crisis, depression, etc. I mean, I think the important thing here is that it was a South Asian commentator who pointed out that Rishi Sunak is not just the first person of South Asian heritage to become prime minister, but is also the first Goldman Sachs prime minister, when you look at his financial background and his involvement in hedge funds. So you can see where his interests lie, and as Martin said, its interests within the whole system. But the first problem that we have is that the entire narrative within which this is being portrayed, how we tackle the cost of living crisis, whether there will be austerity, etc., is being set up, rather effectively, I think, by the PR industry that's developing around Sunak at the moment. I mean, so if you go onto the BBC or any other broadcaster, they'll talk about a 40 or 50 billion black hole in the economy. I mean, this is an invention. It's based on an arbitrary idea that the deficit as a proportion of GDP must be cut over the next 5 years. But that actually wouldn't be the right strategy. The UK isn't in a fiscal crisis at the moment. Our deficit in 2023 will be the second lowest in the G7. As IPPR have pointed out, we can afford to support public services rather than cut them, and we can afford to invest in revitalising the economy sustainably. And then the question is how you go about doing that. Well, we need money in people's pockets to stimulate demand in the economy and get it moving. We need a redistribution of taxation to make the wealthiest pay most. We need to address the huge gap, anywhere between 20 and 80 billion pounds, between what large corporations, transnational corporations, make in profits here and what they should be paying in tax. But we need to get out of the avoidance agenda on that. But above all, what we need is a Green New Deal industrial and economic strategy that creates jobs and addresses climate change. And there's just no sign of that happening from Westminster at all. But as we've been pointing out in terms of Scotland, there is the opportunity to move forward in that kind of direction. So I guess the other issue is what the Scottish government does. It has extremely limited powers. That's important to stress. But again, at the recent SNP conference, and I have to sort of declare an interest here as National Secretary of the Trade Union Group within the SNP, we have lobbied hard for an increase in the tax contribution of high earners across Scotland based on the powers that we do have, limited though they are in taxation, the need to grant local authorities the power and discretion to introduce taxes which meet local needs and protect services, to speed up reform of local authority finance, and that needs to include replacing the council tax with a new residential property tax related to actual value, and then enabling local authorities to charge premium rates of property tax on second homes, unoccupied properties, property development land banks, and so on. There are things that are within the powers of the Scottish Government to do, and I think the reason we need, I mean, particularly a lot of those decisions have to be taken around spring next year. The reason they're important is that if you're going to persuade people, as we should, that independence is vital because there's so much we can't do unless we have it and so much we can do if we do have it, then you have to be able to begin to set that direction. And the measures that I'm talking about there are about addressing the real cost of living crisis, which is going to affect 30 million people across the UK and a very large number of people in Scotland, including in Martin's constituency. So again, UK model is bust. We know what argument we need to make for the future, but for Scotland, there are some small steps we can take forward to address this.
Finally, Martin, I think just to leave on hopefully a positive note, because it's very difficult to get your head round how you can be positive about what is perceived to be an economic crisis. Simon has just explained how it's not perhaps the crisis that's being described, but if you are living in either below the poverty line or close to it, if you're dependent upon food banks, if you're dependent upon metered electricity and gas, which is at a higher rate than if you were paying for it through direct debit, and so on and so on. It's very difficult to put your belief in your investment in a society that seems to be treating you very much like a second-class citizen run by a man who possibly doesn't know the cost of the price of a pint of milk.
Well, I think, my constituents are far more intelligent and more resilient. It's this idea that because you're below the poverty line, you look at the world in a certain way. And my constituents, no matter where in terms of their own personal economics, I think would look at the world in a far more, how can I put this diplomatically? They're not really probably that interested in Rishi Sunak's personal wealth, the Prime Minister's personal wealth. They'll look at it and think it's outrageous. But what they will be concerned about is, okay, that's one thing, but how do I make sure that there's food on the table? How do I make sure the rent's paid? Or the mortgage, just because you might own your own property. For example, in Scotland, we have the highest level of mortgages in terms of constituencies. And there's a reason for that, because most people in Scotland, as a lot of folk across the UK and Northern Ireland, don't come from inherited personal wealth. But that's really seen if you look at house purchasing in Scotland. People who don't, it's the banks and the mortgage companies that own our homes. It's not us. We're not people who usually turn around and say, okay, I'm going to get that property and just buy it in cash. And that's why we've got the highest level of mortgages across the whole of the UK and Northern Ireland. So, I think it's really interesting to, we need to look at the idea of what is poverty and the inequality that it ingrains across. And in mine, you will a whole range of issues, especially related to deindustrialization. And, and I share that. I've seen that happen. I've experienced it firsthand myself. But it's not to say that I have a one idea of what society or those individuals leading it is about. So I think I'd give my constituents far more, I think the word maybe is credence in terms of their own ability to discern what political leadership is about, and that they're probably more likely to support someone like Nicola Sturgeon rather than Rishi Sunak, less on issues around their own personal wealth and actually more on the tangible policy decisions that they make. And I think that with, that's me for selling the SNP cause, but it's also about independence as well. And, the UK state, as Simon and I were saying earlier on, is a busted flush, not because of Rishi Sunak's own, personal wealth. That's maybe just an element of us as to how bad it is. But I think my constituents are far more intelligent than just saying, oh, he's a big, he's a bad wee guy because he's got 730 million. We don't like it. We think it's a bit odd and it's very weird. But we also look at the bigger picture and the policies of inequality, the strange tax decisions, the inability of the UK government to be sustainable in terms of even having prime ministers on a regular basis. That my constituents, I would say, are far more in tune with the reality of politics.
Well, that is all we've got time for this week on this week's Full Scottage, and with the message that we should trust the people from Martin there. Before I go, I just want to remind you that here at Broadcasting Scotland, we depend on the generosity of our supporters. So to everyone who has donated and to everyone who has signed up to make a regular monthly payment, thank you very much. Our programmes will always be free to air and free to view. However, if you can afford £5 a month, please consider becoming a Broadcasting Scotland supporter, and you will find all the information underneath me here on screen. We have set ourselves a target of adding 10,000 new subscribers to enable us to employ staff to make more programmes. So from this Sunday, from me, Donald C. Stewart, here in the studio, whilst I go off and do my geography lesson to make sure I know that Dumbarton and the Vale of Leven are in Martin's constituency, sort out my Wikipedia research, and also ensure that I will make Clydebank built ships part of my history for today. I would like to thank you for watching. Until next time, bye for now.